refreshed? Do you have your coffee so you can handle another 45 minutes? Okay, hydropower. So we have different types of hydropower in mountains. We have reservoir storage systems, we have pump storage systems, and we have run-of-the-river hydro systems. These are quite different, and you need to be aware of those. The reservoir system is a very common one. You build a reservoir and you have a turbine below and you pump. The other one is a pump storage, which means you have two reservoirs, one high and one low. And during the day, when the demand is high, you release water from the top and you store the water below. And in the evening or the night, when nobody uses the water, you pump it back up. And run-of-the-river hydro is you don't build a reservoir, you basically put your turbine right into the river and run it in a continuous basis. So be prepared to look at these three differences. So if you look at hydropower generation, China has been the biggest developer of hydropower in the last few years. This is showing you what has happened from about 1980 to now. You can see the rest of the world. We didn't build very many in the early 2000s, but now, because of the demand for green energy, we seem to have a huge increase in demand for hydropower. So about 71% of the global renewable energy, all the green energy, is actually hydropower right now. This will change very quickly because solar and wind will probably take over very quickly. So what is interesting to me is what happened in over history times. We built most of our big hydropower stations in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then in the late 80s and beginning 90s, there was actually a huge amount of discussion that big reservoirs and hydropower systems are actually bad because they're not very economically viable and they create all kinds of problems for the environment. And so there was a time when the Dam Commission actually said we should no longer build hydropower. But because of climate change now, this changed completely because most of these dams were built in the developed world. And now most of the dams are being developed in the developing world. So if you look at it, by 1990, we had about 40,000 large dams. And since the 1990s, we have had a huge increase in big hydropower initiatives. And there's an International Hydropower Association which puts up some reasonable good statistics on that. So if you look at the new hydropower capacity, which have been added in the last 5 years, you can see it has increased very dramatically in terms of gigawatt power production. And most of it is in China, Brazil, some of it is still in the US, and so that's the capacity. So some of these, like the US and Canada and some of the European ones, they were very established in the 1990s. But this is the new stuff, and it's mostly in the developing world. So traditionally, the capacity has been in the European and North American, but now the new hydropower capacity is in Brazil, China, Laos, Bhutan, Tajikistan. Our Bhutanese friends will tell you that probably the most revenue-making activity in Bhutan is hydropower export to India. And if you look at Russia and Angola, even in Africa now, hydropower is becoming a big deal. And you probably heard about all the controversy about the Ethiopian dam. So hydropower is becoming a new controversy anywhere in the world. Let me show you the pump storage situation. Here is the upper reservoir and here is the lower reservoir. And so typically what you do, you put the highest pump storage capacity is now in China, in Japan, and in the US, where about a third to almost 50% of all the hydropower is generated by pump storage. And the reason why they do that is the following. If you look at Europe, if you can produce electricity from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., from 11 to 2, and from 5 to 8, then you get a far higher price. That's called peak demand. So what they do is they only operate 3-4 hours in the morning, 3-4 hours in lunch, and 3-4 hours in the evening. And the rest of the time they don't use the system. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, when nobody has any electricity demand, they buy very cheap energy to pump the water back up. So in France has a lot of nuclear power, and you cannot shift the nuclear power up and down. It's constant. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, very few people use the electricity, so they can buy that electricity cheap and then pump it up. So that's how it operates. So you can see the increase in China in the pump storage. So the advantage is, obviously, is you can actually make far more money by having a pump storage, because on the electricity prices in Europe, the peak demand prices are far, far higher than the low demand prices. But the disadvantages, of course, are you're reducing the stream flow below the reservoir, and you change the way the river operates. So if you pump back a lot of that water, you don't release it downstream, and you release it at different of the day, which means the whole river system is impacted. So if you look at the real concern about hydropower development, the Mekong now has 11 operational hydropower stations on the Mekong. 7 are planned. Thailand, Laos has 8 planned. Cambodia has 1 operational and 2 proposed. The Salween, which is next to the Mekong, 2 operational in China, 18 agreed, 18 operational, 12 agreed to. And in the Brahmaputra in Bangladesh, India, and China, there are 4 operational and several planned. In Africa, same thing. Ethiopia has huge controversy about that. And in the rest of Africa, there are 22 various countries, which mostly by Chinese and Saudi Arabian investment, are planning to build hydropower. So this is a new emergence and a new issue for mountain water management. So what is the impact of hydropower on the mountain system? If you have a very shallow reservoir during the late summer, they always said, when we have a nice reservoir, this is great tourism and recreational activities. But if you have a very shallow reservoir, this is what happens in one of our hydropower system. You can see the kind of issues. And then you get all these windstorms which blows the sand around, which is very, very damaging. So I don't want to bore you with all the impacts, but here's a summary of what hydropower system does to the environment of a river system. We have hydrological effects, we have water quality effects, we have stream habitat effects, we have impacts on aquatic systems, and we have all kinds of problems with the reservoir itself. So you can see there are huge amounts of issues which we have to address by dams. Have you ever seen a traffic light like this? What does this mean? Well, if you operate on a pump system and you demand, and the water is in high demand on a reservoir system, you release water at different times of the day. So what I'm showing you here is a map of Switzerland. In blue are those rivers which are still flowing naturally without impacts of hydropower. The red is those systems which are impacted by traditional hydropower. That means they make power whenever the demand is high, and the yellow ones are the ones which are peaking at different times of the day. So that traffic sign basically was put up in a number of rivers in Switzerland to warn the tourists, because tourists go down to the riverbanks and have a picnic, and the river flow is very normal, no problem whatsoever. And all of a sudden, when they have these peak flows, they release massive amounts of water, and they had all kinds of accidents where two people actually died when they weren't aware that this is peaking. So this is peaking river systems, and this is a new kind of hazard which we have to start thinking about. So in terms of the mountain systems which are either rain-based or snow-based, we're now finding that when it is snow-based, the peak is actually later in the spring than when it is rain-based. So if this is a discharge of a river which is mainly by precipitation, this is usually when the peak occurs. And if it's snow-based, this is when the peak occurs. And then, of course, if it's glacial fed, you've got this other thing which we talked about yesterday. So if you then look at what is happening now with climate change, you can see that the rain in many parts is increasing, is decreasing. That means we're shifting the peak flow, and because of hydropower, we shift it even more. And so here is a clear example of the snow accumulation in many of our watersheds. So we're shifting from snow to rain, and this has a huge impact for hydropower production because it means it shifts their peak flow. And then, of course, you've got all kinds of issues downstream when these peak flows come, and they're very, very damaging. These are a couple of examples from Nepal where we experienced all kinds of issues. So what is interesting to me is how many rivers remain in the world which are unaffected, which means are still running in a natural way. In Asia, it's about a third of all the system. In South America, about half. In North America, only about 18% of all the rivers are flowing naturally. And all the other ones are impacted. In Europe, it's about a quarter. So keep that in mind. We want to maintain as many rivers flowing in a natural way as possible. But now with this demand for green electricity, this is going to be an issue. Here's an example of a project we were involved in. This is the Coulee Hydropower Project in Nepal. It was constructed in 1982 and worked reasonably well till 92. So we have got a 10-year record of how this system worked. And then in 1993, we had this incredible rainstorm where we got 540 millimeters of rainfall in one day. And here is the hydrograph. You can see a massive amounts of rain happened in 24 hours. We had a watershed project which was in a mountain range, one mountain range away from that system. And we didn't experience very much rain, but it was a very localized kind of storm event. And when you then look at what happened to the sediment, the amount of sediment which was generated before the hydro system was designed This is the amount in terms of tons, a million tons per year. So before the system, when no hydropower was there, this is the amount. And then over the 10 years, when it operated well, this is the amount of sediment we got. And then during the storm, probably that much sediment occurred. And it actually put so much sediment into the reservoir that they lost a third of the lifetime of the reservoir. And then the big challenge now is there is all this sediment in the headwaters, and this is now continuing to produce sediment into the lake. So it's not just this one storm, it's the continuity of this storm. And so after the year after, we still got far more sediments than we did before. So keep that in mind when you look at reservoir. And here is the example of what happened in the headwaters of the mountains. And what is interesting to me is we always said, if you have the mountain area forested, that will protect you more for erosion. And if we do agriculture, that is worse. Well, in this case, it was actually the reverse. In this case, there was more erosion from the forest than from agriculture, because in agriculture, they all have this terraced system. And what happened to the terraced system, they actually retained a lot of the sediment. And in some cases, the sediment actually is not bad because it adds some new soils and nutrients into the system. Just to show you the kind of impact into the lowland, you can see the damage which was created, and look at the size of the particles which were actually deposited on some of these agricultural areas. So the biggest challenge as far as change is concerned is air conditioning. I showed you yesterday that the temperatures are getting very, very high. Remember, we had a number of temperatures above 50 degrees last year. This year, the highest temperature ever recorded in Death Valley was 54.4 degrees. In order to adapt to these high conditions, people will obviously going to have to need more air conditioning units. And air conditioning units are incredibly energy intensive. It takes far more energy to cool air than to warm air. And that means if we continue having these very, very high temperatures, a lot of cities and a lot of communities will have to install air conditioning units, which means much more demand for electricity. So this is showing you what happened in California for hydropower production during a drought. So the blue part of the graph is showing you the electricity production from January to December during normal operations when there wasn't a drought. And then in 2012 to somewhere between 2010 and 2014, we had a massive drought. And so the start of the drought, and you can see the start of the drought in yellow reduced the amount they were able to produce. And then when the peak of the drought, you can see how much less electricity was being able to be produced by hydropower. So the drought not only reduced the amount of water which was available, but then what options did they have? They still had to produce the same amount of electricity. So they actually used natural gas to compensate for the hydropower. And if you look at this, that cost them $2 billion more because of the drought. So the switch, in order to maintain the electricity, which they lost from hydropower, replacing it with natural gas was a huge expense, and of course increased the CO2 as well. So the dam producers always claim it's the environmental and social impacts can be mitigated. But the problem, of course, is it's usually an involuntary movement of people. It creates all kinds of problems with fish. So it is very difficult to minimize the social and economic impacts by big dams. Large-scale projects are considered more economically efficient, but it now appears that some of the small-scale systems might be more appropriate in mountains because they're less damaging. A lot of untapped potential. They claim we have lots more areas where we can do that, but the most suitable sites, particularly in Europe, have already been used, and there's no way you can actually use new areas in many of the developed mountain watersheds. High urban demand, because urbanites can pay, that means economic benefits for high dam production, but the rural benefit to the people in the mountains is relatively small because most of the money just goes down to the developed areas. And then reliable long-term revenue source, that's true, but now with climate change, we have to be very conscious about landslides, sediments, and so on. And what they do now is they build hydropower system with an outlet on the bottom of the dam for sediment release, because otherwise the lifetime of your reservoir is very restricted when you get these big climatic events. So the Columbia Basin is a classic example because we have something like 400 different hydropower systems on this. This is the most intensive hydropower system in North America. We have 15 big hydropower stations in Canada, and here are some of these systems, and some of the reservoirs are 200 kilometers long, just to give you an idea of the size. But what I want to show you is something interesting, because in 1963, when they proposed all these big hydropower dams in Canada, the Americans, because 40% of all the water comes from the Canadian side, why don't you store that water so that it prevents all the flooding in the lowland? And secondly, if you store that water, we can use it for hydropower. So they actually did an agreement over 60 years where the Canadians and the Americans decided they would share the benefits of storing water in Canada. And what happened was they said, we will share 50% of the extra hydropower we can produce in the US because you're storing the water in Canada. And so that means every year Canada would get about $200 to $300 million for sharing the water for hydropower production in the US. This is the first international treaty where the downstream people compensated the upstream people for benefit by storing the water. That's an interesting case study because 1963, they agreed to hold this for 60 years. I want you to think about a treaty right now. What do you think will be the issues 60 years from now? Well, at the time they signed the treaty, nobody ever talked about climate change. Nobody ever talked about fish and environmental services and all that. That was the 60s, right? And now the treaty is actually going to end in 2024, and we need to renegotiate this treaty. And now everything has changed, and now we need to think about 60 years from now, what it will be like and what should we actually consider in order to maintain some sort of environmental services and water. very interesting kind of thing. I thought you might be interesting. Here is an international treaty where people had a tremendous foresight, yet things have changed so much that it's going to be very difficult to actually do a new treaty. So, but the good part about the treaty was because we're getting all this extra money, the people in the basin started to complain and said that money never came to us. It went to the revenues of the government. And so they complained and complained. And so in 1995, the government said, we'll give you $330 million and you can use this for economic development in the mountains. And the people were clever. And what they did is they basically invested that money in hydropower. And they now live off the revenues of that hydropower. So they don't use the 350 million, they just use the revenues, the interest of the power. And this is now being used for developing all kinds of environmentally friendly activities in the mountains. So for example, they're doing now citizen-based science to look at climate information. Particularly, we had very little glacial information. We had virtually no groundwater information. We had very little water quality information, no information on domestic and agricultural water use, no metering, no accounting. And so the community groups now started to get involved in water quality monitoring, in aquatic organism, in stream flow measurements, in geospatial analysis, and so on. And so we actually were involved in helping communities to start producing scientific data so that we have a much better base. Because you can imagine we have 20 communities in that basin and researchers at the university. We get a graduate student to work on one project. We never get a chance to do it on 20 different projects. So citizen science has now come a long way in that we have all kinds of really interesting equipment which actually everybody can use. They don't need a lot of scientific training. For example, we have these temperature sensors which you can put into the river and pull it out every 6 months, and it logs the temperature of the water on a daily basis or an hourly basis. We can do secondary assessment in lakes. We can do all kinds of things. We have portable chemical things. So we actually trained many of these communities to actually do this, to create a better database for a mountain environment. Sediment is a big issue, and we're very concerned about pollution in sediments. So trying to collect sediments in a river is extremely difficult because the sediment moves at peak flow and we're never there at the right time. So what you can do is build in these systems where here's the inlet and here's the outlet. You put it in the river and it will, over, let's say, a 2-week period or a month's period, accumulate sediments, and then you can actually analyze the sediments. So we introduced the community groups to do these kind of monitoring. So we now have a fascinating way of looking at data we never were able to get before. The other thing we did is there is a college within the mountain basin who has a GIS, like Geographic Information System program. And so we said, all the students there have to do a project. Each student should take one watershed and build a GIS database for each of the watersheds where community groups are working in. So they produced for each watershed, now we have about 20 of them, for each watershed they produced a GIS database, and now we can add all the monitoring data, the invertebrate data. A lot of you probably know invertebrates are the long-term policemen of water quality, because you look at the combination of invertebrates in a system, and if it changes, you know something is happening. So this is actually a very interesting thing for community groups to do, because the kids just love all these organisms. So you can get them very excited to learn all about the environment. So this is another way in which we can actually start getting more environmental and climatic data, which is very, very important. And I would like to just tell you the people who have been most successful with citizen science are the bird watchers. The bird watchers are very knowledgeable about birds. They know every bloody bird you can possibly imagine. They know all their habitat, they know everything. And now they have a cell phone. So when they go out, they take a picture of the bird. They get the GIS location. They can then submit this to a central database. And that means we get data on a massive scale, which we could have never done before. And keep that in mind. In mountain communities, we are now at the point where the technology has advanced enough that they can actually do that. So now I'm going to quickly switch, because I did a project 20 years ago trying to look at how could we share information amongst different mountain areas and learn from each other. And this was done at the time when we just started with kind of computing systems. And I thought this example might be a good way to start thinking about what you can do, particularly in terms of the IPROMO approach, where you network. So I'll go through it first, and then we can discuss what kind of things you could actually do. So in 1990, I was fortunate to work a number of people around different mountain watersheds. We had this long-term project in Nepal, and then the funders of our project said, well, how can other people learn what you learned in this watershed? And I said, well, there are lots of other groups who have been doing watershed projects. Why don't we start collaborating and sharing information? So what we did, we said, well, let's develop a framework and identify indicators and use the same methodology and use multimedia tools on watershed management. So the aim was prioritize what the key issues are in each watershed. What are the common problems? What are the unique issues? What were successful developments? And what is transferable to other watersheds? So we selected 4 watersheds in the Andes. This is where they're located. 1 in Ecuador, 2 in Peru, and 1 in Bolivia. 4 watersheds in the Himalayas, 2 in Nepal, 1 in Bhutan for our Bhutanese friend, and 1 in China. And I worked with all of these teams and said, let's try to comparison and let's share some of these experiences. So here is what we did. We said, everybody needs to produce a CD-ROM introducing your project. Each one of these watersheds had to produce a comparison within the Himalayas and use all the information from climate to land use to everything. And these are the South American ones. And then everybody had to use the same indicators, had to show the common and unique issues, and what were their success stories and what did they learn in each of the watersheds. Here are the 4 Himalayan watersheds. Here are the 4 South American watersheds. And here are some pictures. This is the Nepalese watershed, the 2 Nepalese watersheds. This is the Chinese watershed, and this is the Bhutanese watershed. And we worked with all of these to kind of say, well, let's see what we learn from each other. And here the different watersheds in the Andes. Some of you in the Andes are probably familiar with those. And then what we did, we said, okay, let's compare this. So the first thing we said, well, we have to look at what is the mean temperature in all of these areas? What is the precipitation in all of these areas? what is the elevation range and how can we compare all this. And then, of course, also something about population density, growth rates, and so on and so on. And then we said, what are the key issues in each one of these watersheds? So you can see here are all the issues which each one of these watersheds identified as key issues, and number 1, 2, and 3 in each case, and up to 6. And you can see they vary in all places, but what came out is water shortage was the key in almost all of the watershed, and food insufficiency also came up at very high. Soil fertility, a little in the intermediate, and so on. So you can see what the different priorities are. And then we started to look at what are the dominant crops in each of these areas, and we found some huge differences, which you would expect. The dominant crop in the Andes is potatoes, the dominant crop in the Himalayas is rice. Crop biodiversity was very high in the Andes, but very low in the Himalayas. How do you explain this? Well, if you know the potato production in the Andes, some of the farmers have 10 to 12 different potato varieties which they plant in the same field. One variety is good against frost, one variety is good against disease, one variety is good against whatever. And the people actually know what varieties is good for what kind of condition. And they actually trade, they have markets where they trade this biodiversity in potatoes. That has gone completely lost in the Himalayas because their biodiversity in rice is down to maybe 3 varieties because they all were introduced to high-yielding varieties. And the only exception to that is Bhutan, which maintained a lot of this biodiversity because, as you probably know, Bhutan is probably the most benign, environmentally friendly country in the world. Their slogan is be green, and they protect everything. So in all the other parts of the watersheds, crop biodiversity was incredibly low in the Himalayas compared to the Andes. So here's an example where we can learn from each other. And we actually brought in people from Peru to Nepal to actually show them that they should start paying attention to crop biodiversity. I know many of you are interested in general biodiversity, but there's also a big thing you can do with crop biodiversity. Water requirements, all these areas are very dry, so they use crops which are water efficient, whereas in the Himalayas during the monsoon you have lots of water, so usually they use crops which are water efficient, intensive. Cropping intensity in the Andes is very low. In the Himalayas, it is incredibly high. I worked in one of the watersheds in Nepal, which has the highest crop intensity I've experienced anywhere in the world. They grow 4 crops per year by intercropping, which is amazing, but I don't think we can sustain the soil fertility in the long run. So crop diversification, temperatures, frost, all the climatic effects we could address by comparing these kind of things. So we ask each one to say, what are the constraints in terms of biophysical conditions? What are the constraints in human issues? What are the constraints in resource management issues? And then they had to come up with common concerns and common differences. So I just put it up and I won't bore you with all this, but here is the difference in the Himalayas versus the Andes. And this is related to common concerns. This is drinking water concerns. Here is irrigation concerns, soil management concerns, livestock concerns, food management concerns, grassland concerns, forestry concerns, all this stuff. So here is the comparison, and we can now start looking at what has happened. So the common issues were all of these, and the best options to address these common issues were all these. So I just pick up a couple of things like livestock production. Fodder supply improvement was one of the key best options, and agroforestry could play a huge role in helping this. Each group had to come up with a success story where they said, here is where we were successful in addressing either the methodology or the livelihood or the conservation. And these are all the things which they put up, and we highlighted it in the CD-ROM. So what did we learn from all this? Well, we learned that the farmers in the Himalayas are very, very adaptive. They're open to all kinds of tinkering. They're very open to changes and adapting. In the Andes, particularly in the Altiplano, people are far more traditional, and bringing in change is a little bit more difficult. Knowledge, high yield focus in Himalayas, whereas crop biodiversity was the real focus in the Andes. And again, we can learn from both sides. Water resources, completely agreement, and dry season scarcity and upland lowland conflicts were the same issues in both of these mountain regions and in each one of these 8 watersheds. Irrigation focus, much more in the Himalayas, much less in the Andes, but again, they can actually learn from each other. Livestock, very limited diversity in the Himalayas, very high diversity in the Andes. Grazing, very limited and restricted grazing in the Himalayas, whereas grazing in the Andes is one of the biggest activities. And so climatic risk is problematic in both of these areas because of floods and droughts. And again, adaptation of these will apply to both. So the reason why I put this up for you is we did this at the time when we didn't really have the kind of technologies which you're using right now. So right now, you could start considering doing a comparative analysis of all the issues which you're concerned with in your total area and produce an app and communicate over the internet. And the IPROMO forum is probably the best part to do that, because for the first time, you're getting together with people from all over the world and you share the same interest. So why not use this technology to really facilitate science-based information comparisons and learn from each other? So hopefully this gives you a bit of an incentive to collaborate, and this technology which we're using now facilitates this far better than what we did 20 years ago, which is very primitive compared to what you can do now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans. There were a lot of comments, especially concerning the hydropower topic and issue, let's say, because there are different approaches. So I try to sum up, and then other comments or questions are welcome. So starting from India, where the Prime Minister describes dams as the temples of modern India, to Brazil, where dams are considered controversial because of the social environmental impacts. And moreover, concerning that area of the world, that there are issues concerning borders, because the dam is in a country, then the issues are not limited by the border, so affect also other countries. Moreover, there are comments about the impact of climate change on and on the meteorological condition on hydropower, and the general comment is that maybe the issues is not the the dam, but how our civilization use electricity. So this is basically a sum up of what emerged during your lecture. Then if there are other comments and questions are really welcome.
Well, hydropower is probably one of the most controversial issues facing mountains right now. If you look at the dam in Ethiopia, this is probably the classic example of conflicts which we're going to experience. And that's not the only conflict. You look at the Mekong, where the Chinese actually built all kinds of power stations without even consulting the Mekong Commission of the countries below. And so this is going to be a huge issue coming because everybody wants more hydropower. Everybody wants green energy. And so this is going to be a huge economic and social issue. If you look at the Ethiopian dam, where Egypt, when all the countries in the headwaters were no longer colonialized, they became independent, Egypt got allocated a very large amount of the river basin, and none of the upstream countries were actually consulted. And now the upstream countries say, well, we don't agree to this treaty and we need it for our own purposes. And now you will see huge conflicts between the lowland countries and the upland countries. And this is happening not only in Brazil, it's happening in the Mekong, it's happening between India and China, and all kinds of issues. And those are things which we need to really start thinking about, because climate change will make it even worse.
Okay, thanks. There is a question from Antonio. Are there publications from Andes Himalaya comparison? This is an amazing study, really interesting.
Yes, we produced 8 CD-ROMs, one for each one of the watersheds. Each watershed group had to produce a CD-ROM, and then we made a comparison CD-ROM, and I produced about 500 of these and sent them out everywhere. But they were done with a format 20 years ago, which doesn't work with any of these new computer systems. So what I'm trying to do now is I'm going to try to convert some of these into a web app so that it can be accessed. But I'm a little reluctant because, remember, this is 20 years old and things have changed so much in terms of climate change. Why regurgitate old stuff? So my suggestion to you is, why don't you use a similar approach and use the new technology, which makes it so much more user-friendly? But if anybody is interested, I can probably get you some conversions, not all of it.
Okay, many thanks. Other questions or comments?
Okay, can we take a 5-minute break?
Absolutely. Good. Happy coffee.
I'll be right back.